Hello bookworms! This week I want to cover a topic that's a little bit broader in regards to what we review on this channel, or at least the type of reviews that I tend to do. Now, in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of movies go through a reboot or a remake phase. You know, a lot of hits from the 80s and 90s like Jurassic Park, Star Wars, Star Trek, Spider-Man, and so many others are getting these fantastical reboots. And then the rest of the movies that are coming out seem to be adaptations of books. We have things like Insurgent, Paper Town, Mockingjay Part 2, Still Alice, The Martian, 50 Shades of Grey, and so many others that it's hard to keep track of them all. So what exactly makes a good adaptation? Well, that's what I want to take a look at today. And I am going to include movies that are based off of books, as well as movies that are reboots or remakes of previous movies. Now, I want to stress that I do think reboots count as adaptations, and I'll go into that a little bit more as I go through this topic. And my definition of a reboot is a movie that is adding something to an existing franchise. First, let's talk about something that an adaptation shouldn't do. And that's, they shouldn't be following the original material line by line. Now, this does seem like something that would more pertain to books, but trust me, this also makes sense when you're talking about movie reboots. So we'll go ahead and start with the movie-related topics. Think about Terminator Genesis or Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes, or other movies that you would consider more of a remake instead of a reboot. Now, there's a very thin line to actually define which is which, but I think a lot of people would agree that a remake is when you're basically seeing the same movie for a second time. Sure. A lot of these movies have been updated with better technology. CGI in movies can do practically anything nowadays, whether you're talking about makeup, a character design, or special effects. Which unfortunately means that a lot of movie companies think that they can just remake the old movie with a shiny new finish and re-release it to make a quick cash grab. Thankfully, a lot of people are starting to catch on to that trend. That's why when they announced that they were going to make a new National Lampoon's Vacation, you heard a lot of people groaning. We've already heard those one-liners. We want to see something totally new. On the flip side with books, you don't want to see a movie that's a line-for-line remake of the book. I think a lot of book fans think that they would like that until they kind of take into account what that means. For instance, a book like The Da Vinci Code is fantastic at creating suspense. The slow pacing makes every single line that much more dramatic. But that doesn't translate very well into movie form, especially when the other half of that is juxtaposed by action scenes. Of course, the movie is going to make any action scene that much cooler because they're trying to do a Sherlock Holmes meets James Bond thing with that type of movie, but you're asleep for the first half and wake up for when they're running around like it's an action movie. And a movie like Twilight can work here too. Dialogue like, "Say it, vampire," may seem iconic now, but it's definitely being recognized for the wrong reason. That's because the writing is Stephenie Meyer and it's crap. Whatever your opinion is of the actual story, I do think that it could have been done into a movie a lot better if it had had another screenwriter who was able to work with the material better. It doesn't necessarily have to be everything Stephenie Meyer writes. Next, I think an adaptation should be able to add something new to the existing story. Now, before you get mad, I'm not saying that a director or a screenwriter should have full reign over the project and not take into account the original source material. Rather, they need to know what parts become repetitive and what they can make new so that it makes the story better. I'll start by talking about the books this time. In my Harry Potter review, I talk a lot about how the first and second movie really felt like the books, while the third movie really didn't. That's because the first and second movies' director was able to add a lot of little special touches that made the entire world feel so unique. And everything that the third movie's director added was too stylized for the universe that he had created. I love referring to the scene in Diagon Alley when talking about how magical the first movie was, because there are so many little touches that just make it feel so great. For instance, the boys talking about the Nimbus 2000 in front of the storefront window is such a fantastic little touch that wasn't in the books. And it's small enough that it's not a really noticeable difference. But that little tiny extra line of dialogue was able to convey what young wizard boys are excited about and showing Harry one of the many new things in this world that he's just discovering. It is also excellent foreshadowing because you see the broom again later. And of course, movie 3's stylized editions took the magic in a completely different direction from what it was originally designed to be. You can see more of that in my Harry Potter reviews because I go into a lot more detail there. As for movies, we can turn to the new blockbuster that is Jurassic World. Now, if you're gonna make a Jurassic Park sequel, there's a couple different beats that you kind of know that you need to hit. You can see these in the sequels for Jurassic Park 2 and Jurassic Park 3. There's a wonderment scene, a chase scene, a big fight scene where you don't think they're gonna make it. There's underlying romance and a big fight and another wonderment scene and on and on and on. But what Jurassic World did right is that it gave us something we had never seen before, and that was a working park. Yes, we still had all those beats that I mentioned before, and there were a couple scenes that were definitely a wink wink to the audience about the original movie, but having a working park raised the stakes in this movie. This wasn't just an abandoned island or one that was hopefully gonna work with roaming dinosaurs. This was an established, decade-long running theme park. So they did raise the stakes, but we still got to see the T-Rex kick the crap out of some other dinosaurs. And I think that's the best example right now of how you can have something that's so similar to the original source material, in this case with the beats and of what the story needs to hit, but you also get something brand new. Now the next point kind of relates to the last one, and it also kind of relates to the final point. And that is that an adaptation needs to follow the parts of the story that make sense. My favorite book adaptation examples for this right now are Catching Fire and Mockingjay Part 1 from the Hunger Games trilogy. The movies knew exactly what they needed to focus on. If you've read Catching Fire, you know that there's a second Hunger Games tournament, which takes up about 50% of the book. But the movie makes that maybe a third or a fourth of the movie. The rest of it is focused on what we really want to see, and that's the consequences of celebrity and what that means in this universe. And it focuses on the strategy they have to take to make sure they're going to stay alive. And that is what was more interesting to us in the movie. We got to see behind the scenes and see all the manipulation and lies that it took to make it seem like everything was okay, but also for our main characters to survive not in the arena. But Mockingjay Part 1 took it one step further. Mockingjay has never been my favorite book, and I often describe it as just reading about Katniss's depression and inability to cope with everything being thrown at her, which to me wasn't the most interesting thing to read about. But the movie showed her not being able to cope with it, and that was fantastic to watch. For instance, the book begins with Katniss walking around the ruins of District 12, thinking about how they want her to become the Mockingjay and everything that happened to her, and that Peeta's been kidnapped, and everything that's going on that she doesn't feel like she's able to cope with. But the movie takes that little bit of glossed over information and shows it to us. We see her walking around in District 13, trying to calm herself down and remind herself that she is okay now, or at least that's what she's telling herself. We see the leaders of the rebellion trying to make her the Mockingjay and trying to convince her to be on their side. And we see her talking to friends and family about what she should do because she doesn't want to roll in this at all. And as for walking around in District 12 in the ruins, we see that much later because they're using it as a tactic to convince her that she should work for them. And maybe it was a lot of extraneous information that the book didn't feel it needed to tell us, but we absolutely needed to see that in the adaptation. Otherwise, we may have just gotten about 20 minutes of voiceovers while she tried to describe everything. And in a visual medium, it's better to show and not tell what you're trying to say, which is why seeing her go through that struggle made it so much better. Movie adaptation-wise, it's a lot more difficult to point out examples of this, but if you look at George Lucas's more recent work, you can kind of see how this point works with movie adaptations as well. Think along the lines of Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, or any of the Star Wars prequels. All of those movies made a lot more questions than it did answers. I mean, the part of the story that made sense in Indiana Jones is that Indiana Jones is an adventurer. But did we really need to bring aliens into this? Did we really need to bring something that wasn't an ancient artifact? Did we even need to bring Harrison Ford back? Now, I love me some Harrison Ford, but he's getting older and he's not able to do as many of the cool Indiana Jones stunts as he used to do. The Star Wars prequels are the same way. It just creates more questions. And you shouldn't have to question the story for a movie. It should make sense. And it's even worse because the prequels had to be tailored to fit the original trilogy. And it still didn't make sense half the time. Now, I'm not saying that movies shouldn't make you question things, but good movies shouldn't make you question the story and why characters are doing certain things. Finally, we get to what I think is the #1 biggest thing that a movie needs to be a good adaptation. I talked about this briefly in my Harry Potter reviews, and it's the reason why I think certain movies make much better adaptations for that series than other movies. And that is, to be a good movie adaptation, it needs to create the world and feelings of the original source material. This is significantly harder for books that are becoming movie adaptations because one person reading a book is going to have a much different interpretation than another person, whether that's the writer, the reader, the director, the screenwriter, etc. But let's be honest, that's why authors put so much work into describing their world, so that it can be represented correctly in the reader's minds. Take a look at Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien not only wrote 4 books about the same world, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Return of the King, and The Hobbit, but he also wrote a ton of extra source material, which included a lot of extra stories and myths about the world, maps, and other languages so that each race could have its own way of speaking. And for the movie adaptation, there was a lot of care put into making it so that everything would be represented correctly for the fans to see on the screen. However, now let's look at 50 Shades of Grey. As a movie, it's the perfect example of how an adaptation fails to live up to how the book feels and also didn't follow the right parts of the story. 50 Shades of Grey is not a good book unless you get to the parts where her inner goddess is talking to her or you're reading about the sex. The interaction and dialogue between the two main characters is jilted and awkward, and that's exactly what we got in the movie because they followed the script really closely in the parts where they felt that they could follow the script. In order for the director and the crew to make a good movie, which I think they were trying to do, they unfortunately had to cut out a lot of the best parts of the book, whether you enjoyed it as a comedy because of the inner goddess or the raunchiness. In the end, 50 Shades is a beautifully shot movie and the actors gave the best performances that they could with the dialogue that they were given. But that's not what the movie was supposed to be. The book is silly and raunchy, and that's what people wanted to see in the movie. 50 Shades of Grey the movie didn't feel like 50 Shades of Grey the book, and that's why I think a lot of people kind of saw it and just went, meh. So if you're ever a screenwriter and you're trying to write an adaptation for the latest book or one of the popular movies from the early 2000s, just remember, you're welcome to add new things to the story, but you better stay true to the feeling of the original source material. Otherwise, you're probably not going to do very well. Thanks for watching, Bookworms. If you like seeing content like this, click below and subscribe. We're making new content every week. Or at least we're trying to. And as always, keep reading!